Today's episode is with Matt
Start to the
Tesauro.
day. Just reviewing stuff in GitHub. How do you say this politely? So there's shifting left, which I think is a good thing. And DevOps has been great, and it's allowed a lot of visibility into processes that were just sort of the mystery thing that the sysadmin did back in a corner office somewhere. I produced 20, 30 findings in a pen test probably, and that's a pretty noisy pen test. Handing 666 issues to a developer is just a way for them to go, you know what, if I'm investing time or money towards a problem, am I avoiding future instances or am I solving a one-off? Those are the things to avoid. Like, those are fundamentally non-stop, non-negotiable. These have to be nailed down. Understanding that improvements are going to be iterative, right? You have to start slow. It's the whole boil the frog idea.
Hi everyone, this is Purushottam, and thanks for tuning into Scale to Zero podcast. Today's episode is with Matt Tesauro. Matt is a DevSecOps and AppSec guru who specializes in creating security programs, leveraging automation to maximize team velocity, and training emerging and senior security professionals. When not writing automation code in Go, Matt is pushing for DevSecOps everywhere via his involvement in open source projects, presentations, trainings, and new technology innovation. Um, it's wonderful to have you with us, Matt. For our audience who may not be familiar with you or your work, do you want to briefly share about your journey?
Oh my, it's been a journey. So I started out life. I'll try to wrap this up quickly. I started out life actually as an economics undergrad student at university because this is early days, this is late 90s, and computers weren't as much of a thing as they are today. And I got almost through my degree before I realized, wait a minute, people will pay me to fart around on computers, which I already like to do anyway. So I did the math, and it was quicker for me to graduate with my undergrad in econ and get a master's in MIS, which is what I ended up doing. I worked for a telecom company. It's a very strange beast. Their IT operations were in Texas. Almost all of our customers were in the UK, Netherlands, France, and Belgium. So if I messed up as a developer, and I was a software developer initially, if I messed up as a developer, I had an angry Belgian calling me at like 2 a.m. yelling at me, get out of bed and go into work. And yes, this was long enough ago that you didn't remote to work. I actually had to drive my car to work. So that was great. I wouldn't recommend that, and you don't have to do it anymore, so it's okay. I went from being a developer to running a bunch of systems for the Texas A&M University, the business school there. That's where I kind of caught the security bug. Went from there to doing pen testing. I did pen testing for a number of years, and I really enjoyed it. It's fun to creatively think about how to break into systems. But after a while, it just felt like it was like every Monday, here's your URL, here's your creds, go beat up on this web application. By the end of the week, write up a report. And next week it was the same. And after doing that for several years, I hate to say it because it was still fun, but it also just kind of got monotonous. And so I went and joined Rackspace and started their product security team back when Rackspace had their own cloud. And so the product security team owned the entire cloud infrastructure for Rackspace, everything that made it run from the iron up. And that was a heck of a challenge and quite a fun place to work. Worked there for a number of years, worked at a couple other large corporations, worked at Duo Security, which is a really great startup. And now I am the CTO and co-founder of Defect Dojo, Inc.
That's quite a journey, all the way from economics to pen testing to running your own company now, right? So I'm curious, like today, what does your day look like?
My day look like. I usually start the day with a large cup of coffee, a very large cup of coffee, just because I'm a bit of a coffee snob. I roast my own coffee, so I have a friend who taught me to do that, and now I'm stuck. But I started the day with a large coffee, and actually for the since I was at Rackspace, we created this thing called Defect Dojo, which is an open source vulnerability management platform. And every morning I go and I look at what's come in that night, either issues or PRs, review those. And that's kind of how I start my morning. It sounds like an odd thing to say, but it's a nice, easy start to the day. Just reviewing stuff in GitHub. Somehow I enjoy that. And then it's whatever the day has for me. This could be customer calls. This could be doing something like this, being on an interview. I'm also currently on the board of directors for the OWASP Foundation. So occasionally I'm doing board meetings with the OWASP board or handling some kind of issue with that. And then it's just work stuff, which can be anything from very technical issues like nuanced bugs that we find in our software, or it can be setting up systems so that we can be successful and doing automation and trying to me, a lot of what I find, and this is true beyond just security, actually, now that I think about it as a co-founder, but visibility into what's going on is so huge. And so I'm currently working on bubbling up as much visibility as I can about the various pieces of software and processes in my current life, so that we can make better judgments. Because a lot of times you sort of get caught, right, as any level of an employee with, I have to make a decision. I don't have really good information. So it's like I either guess and get lucky, or I find that information. And sometimes finding that information can take forever. So I like to have things presented, even if they're not necessarily useful every day, all day long. There are times when you're like, wait a minute, what is the best or the most used something, right? Well, boom, if I have a list of how many people are using what, I can go look that up quickly and answer that question.
Right. Sounds like you have your hands full with a lot of activity, all the way from being in fixing bugs or reviewing others' code to running a company, right? So I'm excited to talk about some of the things that you have been doing for some time, right? So let's start with the topic of DevOps. So DevOps practices have been followed for years, but security was never a core part of the process, which sort of led to the DevSecOps movement. Um, the core idea is that you address the security concerns as soon as possible in the development cycle. With that being said, what's your thought? How is that transition going from DevOps to DevSecOps?
Yeah, so I'm seeing lots and lots of people adopt the idea of DevOps or DevSecOps or whatever you want to call it. There's all sorts of names for it these days. So it is definitely there, and it's a goal for a lot of businesses. But I think there's how do you say this politely? So there's shifting left, which I think is a good thing. And then there's shifting left without the F in shift, which is a different thing to the left, that you probably don't want to do. So like I do have some concerns about doing everything as early as possible, because there are some things you can't do. I ran into this very thing at Rackspace. We were running a cloud. You have many, many, many services, all doing different versions. Finding an environment that matched the new version of, say, compute with the old version of all the other parts of the cloud so you could test it, while another group was launching a different part of the cloud with the new version, but all the other things the same version number. Like, these get really complex, and you can really only test those interactions in a live running environment. So I think shifting left is great. I think you have to do it with a little forethought, though, because not everything can be shifted left. The other thing is that I think DevOps has been great, and it's allowed a lot of visibility into processes that were just sort of the mystery thing that the sysadmin did back in a corner office somewhere. And they were all very manual, and now that they're repeatable, I think that's a huge win.
Right.
But the thing is, when you're doing DevSecOps, you're going to surface a lot of issues, right? If you start looking around and flipping over rocks, you find things. And having a place to put those results and pre-filter them, because some of them, like anyone who's ever used a security tool knows, they're going to say, oh my goodness, this is bad, right? And you look into it and you're like, well, actually, that's not bad because A, B, and C. That's actually a false positive. But if you push, I've seen some people, and it just makes me die a little on the inside, want to run a tool and push results directly to the developers, and it's like, stop. Like, you need to have some place to store and pre-filter those before you push them on, because if they're not build-breaking items, if you are doing CI/CD and breaking builds on things, you still may want to handle them, but you don't need to. You don't need to handle all of them, and you need a human in there somewhere to say, okay, of these 5 things that the CI/CD run is complaining about, 3 of them are actually actionable, 2 of them are false positives, and of those 3 actionable ones, this one we really need to fix because it's spooky. The other 2, we'll put those in the backlog, we'll get them sorted out, but they're not crucial. So that whole idea of cadence and the speed, I think, has really pushed people, uh, unfortunately, in a direction of, well, let's just shoot it all straight to the developers, but you can't dump that stuff on the developers and expect them to do this thing called developing.
Hmm. And it gets overwhelming, right? And that's where, as you are highlighting, like there has to be that person in the middle who helps with the prioritization. That hey, there are, let's say, 20 items. Out of those, we only need to focus on the three. The rest 17 can be put it in the backlog. So if that's the case, like how can organizations address that challenge when they are sort of transitioning from DevOps to DevSecOps?
Yeah, so as you're doing this automation, if you do it right, you're going to produce a lot more results, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and it used to be, I mean, I can remember the good old days of pen testing. I'd produce 20, 30 findings in a pen test probably, and that's a pretty noisy pen test.
Mm-hmm.
You'd write it up, you'd submit it, and you were done. But if you do automation, you can have 20 or 30 things happen in one review of, say, some source code. Or goodness, I had one time I jokingly called it the static analysis of the beast. I ran SAST against something and got 666 findings, right? Like the number of the beast. So that's just like handing 666 issues to a developer is just a way for them to go, you know what, this is ridiculous. I give up. I'm just going to go get into my IDE of choice and write some code. So
Mm-hmm.
I think having that, like I said earlier, that single source of truth where all
Mm-hmm.
of the results can go to that first, and then you can do things like do reporting out of that, right? Ideally, push things into a bug tracking system. You can
Right.
actually learn what's happening across your software, right? Is one particular team really bad about injection attacks, but the other team has got that sorted, but their, say, library management is a mess? You don't know that till you start looking and getting that visibility that really helps you focus efforts on improving. So that
Mm-hmm.
having a place that's sort of a security team's area to manage and look at those results before they talk to downstream systems like developers, like management, is very, very important. I mean, my mantra at RAC was if you ever wanted to find my foot in your backside, you would pass down a non-actionable finding to the dev teams, right? Because it's so hard to get that credibility with the dev teams, and you can blow it with one stupid reporting of a
Yeah.
non-actionable or false positive.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I want to talk about that in a bit. I have one follow up question on this. So, you highlighted that there are several uh, challenges when it comes to adopting DevSecOps, right? If I'm running a fintech startup, growing startup, is it necessary? Do I need to invest in DevSecOps?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So to me, I would answer that is it depends on how you define DevSecOps, right? Should you create systems that automatically deploy things in a secure or somewhat hardened state? Oh, heck yeah. You should be using some kind of configuration management or automation to lay out your infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
That's just like fundamental work, right? Um, should you like have red green deployments on your first day, the first time you push out your software to the world? Oh, heck no. Right? That's very mature things. So to me, it's picking your poison, right? Getting those fundamental things that, particularly for a startup, you're limited on people, you're limited on time and resources, you're generally limited on money. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to pick your battles carefully. But
Mm-hmm.
the way I like to think about those things is if I'm investing time or money towards a problem, am I avoiding future instances or am I solving a one off? And I want to put systems in place that avoid those future problems. The whole thing about configuration management and automation, that may not get me a completely hardened deployment of, say, my product, but I have an
Mm-hmm.
automated deployment. If I find a problem, it's tweaked, say, the Terraform and
Mm-hmm.
reapply it and get a hardened version of it. So it gives me the fundamentals I need to be quick and agile and adjust to the changing world. Where if I had somebody who just handcrafted a bunch of commands in a terminal over an SSH session, yeah, you can set up something, but it's not repeatable. God help you if that person gets hit by a bus, right? Like there's all those kind of issues around it that could
Yeah.
be very detrimental to a startup.
Okay, that makes sense. So start small, set the basics right, and then depending on if you are fixing longer, like if you are setting up the pipeline or setting up the process in a way which helps in the longer term, prioritize that over one ops. So yeah, makes a lot of sense. Now, one of the things that you highlighted earlier, right? Like organizations started adopting DevOps for speed of delivery. So when it comes to security, like adding security, sometimes the processes slow down a little bit, right? Not the actual deployment, but the overall integration of security into the DevOps world. So how can organizations find the right balance between the speed and integrating security in the DevSecOps?
Yeah, this is a fun one too. So, in my mind, where this comes down to is understanding your risk profile, right? Not everybody is subject to advanced APTs. Granted, there's some baseline things you should do to protect yourself from malware in general and what have you, but not everybody is facing that kind of thing. So, it's really finding your right level of practice, right? Which is a nuanced answer. I mean, unfortunately, what I like to think about is, are there existential items that you just can't have happen, right? If you're a financial institution, there are certain things that the bank regulators really, really don't like. Like, those are the things to avoid. Like, those are fundamentally nonstop, non-negotiable. These have to be nailed down. Right now, the other issue is like tool cadence, right? So some tools you can run very quickly. SCA tools against a repo, the software composition analysis, those are generally pretty quick. Those run in almost real time. Static analysis and dynamic analysis, SAST and DAST, can be very long-running processes depending on the complexity of what you're testing. So
Right.
this comes down to a cadence issue, right? I don't want to slow things down, but I still want to know that my deployed app is secure from a DAST perspective or a SAST perspective. How do you handle this? What I did at Rackspace was I set a cadence. So we had like the most aggressive team at Rackspace was deploying 75 times a week, which is nutty fast.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no time to even run a tool at that speed. Any tool, pretty much. Well, I mean,
Right.
maybe FCA, but most of them, it's a non-starter. So what I ended up doing was deciding that I'm going to for the very first CI/CD run, I'm going to fire off DAST, and I'm going to have a way for that runner to know it's still running. And as long as it's still running, you just get a pass. And then when it
Okay.
finds out that it's no longer running, I kick off a new one, right? And I'm just continually running that scanner as fast as I can run it, but skipping the times when there's a CI/CD run happening, but the tool is still chewing through what's been deployed.
Okay.
And this is where that infrastructure automation can really help you, because if you can have CI/CD fire off sort of a canary deploy that doesn't matter and isn't part of production, your test can take as long as it takes. It doesn't matter as long as you have the method to clean that junk up after that test is done. So that becomes a huge value to the process. And then
I really like that approach. So sorry to interrupt. Like I really
yeah,
like that approach where you are not blocking the deployment, but at the same time you are achieving the security analysis as well, right? Like you are doing it on the side, and as soon as you have the findings, you present it to the developer or the product team so that they can prioritize and work on it. So yeah, I that's lovely actually.
well, it's a very pragmatic approach, because both of those both teams in that process have something to do, right? The dev team
Right.
has things they need to get out the door, and the
Mm-hmm.
security team or product security team or DevSecOps, whatever you want to call them, they need to know that the thing that made it out the door is as secure as reasonably possible. And when
Right.
those clash, then you can try as a security team to say no and be the no cop, but that gets you nowhere. So it's
Mm-hmm.
much better to say, okay, we both need two things. They're contending with each other. Neither one of us can really win. How do I make this so that we both win? And that cadence thing was a huge, that really helped me a ton at Rackspace, because I ran into that to where these teams were moving so fast. I'm like, I can't even. And the flip side of it is if you do have a team that's moving fast, that also means that issues can be fixed really fast, right?
Exactly.
Worst case
Yeah.
scenario in my history was a SQL injection on a login page that lasted a year in production, which that was a year of having like my heart kind of clenched, just waiting for someone to pop this.
Yeah,
And then the
that's
opposite
scary.
end, yeah. Oh, and then the opposite end was at Rackspace. We had one team that team that did 75 deploys a week.
Hmm.
One of the guys working for me was testing it, finds an issue, gets an IRC, which is what we used at Rack. It says, "Hey guys, I found this issue. If I do this, this bad thing happens." They were like, "Hey, can you send me the HTTP?" Yeah, sure. Here's the HTTP request response pair. This is what the attack looks like. And they were like, "Okay, cool, thanks." And then 20 minutes later, they were like, "We pushed a fix to production." We were like, "We haven't even written up the finding yet." So we literally opened and closed the bug because it was fixed before we could report it. So although it feels spooky when you have to make these adjustments for fast moving teams, you do get a
Hmm.
benefit as a security person, right?
Yeah.
Instead of waiting, 6 months to get a thing released, it can happen in 20 minutes, which is kind of
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. And that's a good segue to my next question, which is, um, like earlier you mentioned that as a security person, if I go to a development team with a non-actionable issue, or I go to them with something which is a false positive or something like that, that sort of breaks the trust, right? And that goes back to how the culture is set up in the organization, because not every organization focuses on security from the get-go, right? So how, like I want to understand like how you have done it in the past, or how you think about it, like how can organizations ensure that the security mindset at least is baked into the teams from the beginning, rather than doing it a year later, right? As you highlighted, like there was a SQL injection issue which was there for a year, but if the organization had the security mindset, could that have been resolved within a month instead of a year? Like how do you think about it?
Yeah, unfortunately, with that 1 year SQL injection, that was about the cadence that they did releases. So that was just
Okay.
a not high performing organization. Well, that's not true. They did 2 releases a year. They couldn't
Hmm.
fit it into the next one when we found it, so it had to go a full year. It was really
Okay.
painful. So that's more of an organizational agility issue in that 1 year of SQL injection. Ugh,
Hmm.
still makes me cringe. But generally speaking, I think it boils down to being just really pragmatic, because I think a lot of security people try to be purist, and I'm as guilty as the next person about doing that early in my career, where I would just rail and fight against the man and no, you can't do that. That's not right. This is broken. We have to drop everything and fix it. And I just realized all that got me was like not being invited to important meetings and otherwise being shunned by my peers. So
Hmm.
I needed to change. And so it came down to very pragmatic thinking and empathy about the situation that the other party's in. So another great example of that. Also at Rackspace, I learned so much there. It was a great crucible to learn stuff in. Um, we had an issue that affected our entire compute, or a large portion of our entire compute cloud. So this is tens of thousands of machines that need to have something done to them to address an issue.
Hmm.
Well, you don't just like update and restart 10,000 machines that are actively hosting people's cloud infrastructure. So this is
Right.
a very complicated process. It was a really ugly problem. How do we resolve it? Well, prior to me getting there, there had been this idea of SLAs
Hmm.
around the criticality of the finding. Very standard practice. A critical is so long, high is
High
a little
is
bit
so long.
longer.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
that thing. I threw that out because
Okay.
under that SLA, this restart 10,000 computers was supposed to happen in 24 hours. Like that physically isn't going to happen. Just period. Right? So unless we want to like disrupt all of our customers, which was a
Hmm.
non-starter.
Yeah.
So what do you do? What I came up with is I changed the SLO definition to say a fix in place by X was
Hmm.
a mitigation plan in place by X. So
Okay.
24 hours for a critical to have a mitigation plan in place. So what did we do?
Hmm.
I sat down with the compute team. We talked through all of the really ugly wrinkles about making this fix happen, and we set a timeline. And I put a date in my calendar
Hmm.
that said they say they'll have it fixed by this date, and then I backed up 3 weeks. and put another thing in my calendar that said, hey, check with the compute team and see how they're doing on problem X, right? And it just changed the mindset, because instead of coming to them and saying, oh, no, we have a 1-day SLA, you have to have it fixed in a day, which was complete hogwash. That was never going to happen.
Yeah.
So by changing that conversation to, I don't need you to fix it, but I need to have a date, I can put in a calendar and a plan in place that I can tell management, this is why we're working to make this better. That's all it takes. And it completely changed the nature of the conversation at the table, because unfortunately the team that I was dealing with had dealt with that critical must be fixed in 24 hours thing and done some Herculean efforts to fix former bugs that they didn't want to do again because it made their lives awful. And so we were able to come to a reasonable accommodation. And this is that empathy and understanding both sides have, both sides have issues that they have to confront. And how do you find that middle ground?
Sense. So one, I like how you put it, right? Like security teams think that all the security issues should be addressed. Like very much like how QA teams sometimes take it as well, right? That, hey, if I have found a bug, you cannot accept it, you have to address it, right? So it's very relatable. Now the question is, any tricks or tips you have for security team members to, let's say, work with other teams to make sure that things get prioritized properly?
Yeah, and a lot of that comes to what I mentioned earlier. It's the empathy thing, right? Just understanding where they're coming from. And I think this is where I was a little bit fortunate in that in my early background, I was a developer. I dealt with this junk. As a developer, I dealt with hey, somebody hands you a PDF of like 47 findings, a third of which are bunk. And I have to burn a day or two to disprove these things that they're not really vulnerable and then go fix the things that are. And by the end of the process, I'm just angry at the world, right? It just didn't, it didn't work, right? So I think having that empathy and trying to get in the shoes of the people you're dealing with, and I mean, shoot, if you can pull this off, spend a day or two doing, like shadowing the person that you're providing vulnerabilities to, see what their day is like and understand how you can derail these things. And I mean, honestly, I've never seen a developer have in their quarterly or annual goals, like fix all the security stuff. Maybe that's happening. I've never seen it. So you are also kind of fighting the system where the developers are incentivized to get stuff out the door as quick as possible. That's what the business wants. But your job is there to get it out securely. So you have to find a way to make them understand why, like the fact that, yes, you can get this out today, but there's going to be an issue that we're going to have a fix. If you have to sort of circle back on that issue, you're burning more cycles. Let's spend, 10, 20% more now and not fix it in 2 weeks when you've forgotten even what you wrote for that feature, which is a lot of what development is like. Like, yeah, I wrote that a month ago. I don't remember. Like, I've written so much code since then. Who knows? So I think it's mostly that. And then understanding that improvements are going to be iterative, right? You have to start slow. It's the whole boil the frog idea. Like I will say, like incremental improvements will beat perfection every single time, without a doubt. And then
without instead of a big bang kind of an approach, right?
Oh yeah, I can't tell you how many people are like, we're gonna do a static assessment of all 3,000 of our apps this year, and they get 6 months in and they're like, oh my god, we're at 200 apps, we're never gonna make it, and it just peters. Okay, make it reasonable. Like I'm gonna run. I did this at Duo Security, so I was able to containerize the running of a SCA tool for Duo Security and wire it into I was going to say the GitHub, but we actually had multiple GitHubs at that time. Wire it into the GitHubs or the GitLabs. Actually, I take that back. We had multiple GitLabs. But anyway, we had like 6 different Git repositories that were used by different teams. That was an unfortunate thing, but whatever. But I wired it into that, right? And now I can run this very lightweight. I didn't turn on all of the features of the SCA tool. I ran it in its sort of lightest configuration and ran it across all of the apps. Now, with the automation and everything else I did was 46 Python repos in 3 minutes, which is stupid fast, right? But now what does that give me? That gives me the ability to, one, I have a smell test across all of the apps. I know the ones that are
Mm-hmm.
pretty clean. I know the ones that are really a mess. And now I can
Mm-hmm.
prioritize. Okay, these ones are a mess. Why are they a mess? Oh, they're not doing. Oh, I see what they're doing. Their updates aren't happening correctly. They don't have, say, wired in Dependabot or whatever. Let's get that going with these guys and get them shored up. And then I can move on to those laggards laggards, they're not really laggards, the lower
Priority
issue
ones.
count people, yeah, and
Yeah.
sort them out. So, I mean, some of it just comes to getting that visibility and then making, because I mean, I've never seen a security team that was bored or had too many people, right? So this is where you have to pick your battles very
Yeah.
carefully.
If like we spoke about rack space quite a bit, right? And there is a lot of automation aspect of it. But when it comes to automation, let's say you are incorporating security measures through automation, one misconfiguration could introduce vulnerabilities which could be difficult to identify and remediate. So, how should organizations automate their security when it comes to cloud environments so that they do not introduce more misconfigurations or vulnerabilities rather than addressing them?
Another great question. So I like to think of this, and the way I propose this before in meetings and whatever is my little saying is, you know, there's going to be issues, and you know there's going to be changes. Like that's a given with IT, right? You just
Mm-hmm.
can't avoid that. So your choice is: do you want a pebble dropped on your head every day, or a boulder at the end of the month, right? So how could I break this up into little tiny things that
Mm-hmm.
make a work effective? So great example of that. Also, funny enough, at Rackspace, although I did it in a lot of places after Rackspace as well, is for configuration management. So Puppet, Chef, Ansible, whatever you're using, Salt, doesn't matter. What we would do is the product security team would bless a specific tagged version in Git of a way
Okay.
to deploy whatever the product was, right? So version 3 of Cloud Files, deploy
Mm-hmm.
one, deploy 10,000 of those. I don't care. Now,
Mm-hmm.
anytime they made a commit to that repo and changed the configuration, we had a say on the PR to give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down so that we knew that once we got it hardened, we weren't having drift. And that changed the problem from I have to deploy a thing, I have to do a whole bunch of security tooling to assess the configuration and hardening of it, to I have to look at a diff of code. Oh, look, they're
Mm-hmm.
just changing this like unimportant part of the config to set a message of the day when you SSH in. I don't
Mm-hmm.
care. That PR goes. And so
Mm-hmm.
I've changed the process from being this large body of work to just this little differential change,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you can do that kind of work, it makes it hugely beneficial. And some of this is just doing, honestly, I would, it's almost silly, but I'd call it pragmatic. I had
Mm-hmm.
one developer I worked with at a different corporation that just because of the way the corporation worked and how findings were passed out, I had to provide PDF reports, which I really don't like. I'd much rather do things in a bug tracker, but whatever,
Mm-hmm.
that's what they wanted. Okay, so here's my PDF report of the things I found. And I got
Mm-hmm.
pinged by the developer. He goes, man, these PDF reports are really a pain. Is there any better way for me to look at them? And we were using Defect Dojo at the time, and you can export the findings in Defect Dojo as CSVs. And I'm like, sure. How about a CSV of all the issues in your product? He's like, oh my God, you can give me that? I'm like, yeah. So boom, I gave him a CSV. Wasn't official, wasn't the normal process, but it
Right.
made his life much better, and we got stuff fixed. Right. So it's that kind of being flexible and having pragmatism is
Mm-hmm.
really, really valuable. And the other thing that I
But
found too that can be really a killer is, and this happens more in bug bounties than in internal things, although I've seen it in internal things as well, is you get a report that says this is bad, right? This has this issue. Like, okay, how did you come to this conclusion? Like,
mm-hmm.
can you show me that it's bad? Where, like for a web app, where is the request response pair? These are things that as a developer, I want to see. Like I put a single tick into the search field and the app blew up. Okay, maybe that happened, but can you show me like the response that came back? Was it an error message
Hmm.
on screen? Was it an HTTP 500? I need more details. So providing
Yeah.
sufficient details is hugely valuable to dev teams and can really win you a lot of friends, because if you give them everything they need to fix it, guess what? They're way more likely to fix it.
Absolutely. Like again, this takes me back to the QA and developer battles as well, right? Like without enough context, without enough detail, sometimes developers feel frustrated that hey, I'm not able to reproduce, or I don't know if it even is the critical priority. So that's where adding that additional context or details helps. Um, Win points like from a relationship perspective, and also it makes the developer's life easy as well, right? uh,
Oh, yeah.
Another thing that you highlighted which I really liked is that you, let's say you have a hardened environment you have already set up. Any change, you're just looking at that change rather than the entire hardened environment, because you have already sort of verified and certified in a way, right, that from a security perspective. One of the one question to that is, nowadays we use open source software quite a bit, right, where we are not only dependent on our own code, but we are also using others code. And I think there was a recent study by Anchor where they highlighted that around 85 to 97% of the enterprise code bases use open source. So in that case, how do you think about one, like securing your applications, and the second thing is, uh, how should organizations tackle these like supply chain security issues?
Yeah, no, oh, more great questions. Just like a nonstop flood of great questions. So,
Thank you.
um, open source software, I think what people need to remember is open source software is free, but it's free as in puppy, right? You may get it for no dollar. You still got to feed and water and take the thing outside and deal with the maintenance of the thing. So yes, you
Hmm.
don't have to burn dev cycles to write it, which is great, but you still own the problem of keeping it updated and secure. So I think there's some of it is a mindset thing of like, hey, we get this for free and I don't have to worry about it. Let's use that. Well, not really. And this is what that 85% or 7%, whatever it was, shows you. Like
Hmm.
a lot of people have that mindset. The truth is that SCA tools have gotten pretty mature. I can remember when they were terrible, and they've gotten significantly better. So the thing here is to use them as early as possible. For example, for the Defect Dojo project, we have
Hmm.
Dependabot, Renovate, and another one. Shoot, Sneak, I think. I can't remember what the other one is. We have three different tools that look at our dependencies, either
Hmm.
container based, libraries in Python, or the images that we use as the basis for our containers. Right, all that's
Hmm.
wrapped up. Every PR gets run through those. Right, so we are continually looking at this. Was it a pain in the butt to get up to date the first time? Yes. Yes, it was, because we weren't doing that initially. It's a 10-year-old project. That 10 years old, we
Right.
weren't talking about SCA. But yes, we did have to sort of allocate a good chunk of time to catch up. But
Hmm.
now that we're caught up, it's like I said in the beginning of this podcast, it's my morning routine. Oh, look, Dependabot says this library's out of date. I'll update it in the dev branch. It can soak for a week. We'll do a release at the end of the week, and we'll know it's okay or not based on the QA stuff that we do. So, like, it is a very solvable problem if you can get over that initial hump. The
Hmm.
other thing I've seen that's been highly effective is for the, well, let me back up a step. I was at a DevOps days in Austin, and I was speaking
Hmm.
to the person at the time was the CIO of American Airlines.
Okay.
And we're talking about this very same issue. And he said, you know what I did that just made it a world of good was I looked and did an inventory. And we
Hmm.
had, I guess they were a Java shop, if I recall correctly. Don't quote me on that, but I think they were a Java
Okay.
shop. But he looked and they had like 6 different logging libraries that different teams were using. He was like, "This is kind of stupid. Logging is a
Hmm.
thing it's been sorted out years and years ago in computer science. We just need one." And I
Hmm.
doubt that any one is so much better than the other that it's worth having two, etc. So he challenged his dev teams and said, "You guys need to pick only one logging library, authentication library, all the major pieces that you end up using open source for. You guys
Right.
pick. I don't care, but we're not having 3 or 7. We're having one." And he
Mm-hmm.
let the dev teams duke it out, however they did. And they came
Mm-hmm.
up with an official list. Now, what was really awesome, he said, and he didn't expect to happen, was you're a new dev who just gets hired in to go write software for them. There's a
Mm-hmm.
wiki or a web page or some internal documentation that says, if you need to do logging, we use, log4j or whatever the library
Right.
is, right?
Right.
And all of that kind of whatever inevitably happens when you have a new dev show up. Well, that last place I used, log. I like logging, JavaScript library or Java library. I'll just grab that because I know it. And now you have
Mm-hmm.
two. And then you hire somebody else new, and she used to use Weeby login Java library, and so now you have three. And honestly, if you just had the information up front and told them,
Mm-hmm.
no, this is a library we use. Oh, okay, whatever, fine, I'll just use that. Right? So he got tons of benefit out of just telling the dev teams,
To
you
sort of
pick,
standardize, right? Instead of
yeah,
going
standardize.
everywhere. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And he didn't impose it on them. He said, you guys pick, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
crucial, right? They owned their fate, but they
Yeah.
could only pick one, right? Which is important.
Nonsense. So a similar or a related question to that is um, vulnerabilities, right? Like as you use open source libraries, it's not just with open source libraries, it is with our code as well. Like there is a possibility of opening up some, like having some vulnerabilities in our code as well, right? So like what's an ideal process or practice look like to sort of look at the vulnerabilities or prioritize them or address them? How do you look at the vulnerability management?
Yeah. As a whole, that's a huge thing. I, wow. I don't even know how to start answering that one. There's a whole bunch of angles on this. Some of it depends on the tool. Some of it depends on the organization.
Mm-hmm.
From a tool perspective, uh, like let's say SAST. SAST is a great one to start with. SAST is
Mm-hmm.
well known to produce loads and loads of results, right? So let's say you're working with a team, you run SAST because they haven't done it yet or they haven't done it in a while or whatever, and you get, I don't know, thousands of findings. Well,
Yeah.
you know right away that's a non-starter. I'm not going to hand them, here's your 10,000 findings, go fix this in a week or whatever the SLA is. That you so what happens when that what have I done when that happens? I go and talk to
Mm-hmm.
the manager of that team and say, hey, look, you obviously have some issues here. Like I also understand that I can't have you sideline your entire team for 2 months to just knock out all these issues. So here's
Mm-hmm.
what I'm going to do. I'm going to run this SCA or this SAS tool and only produce criticals and highs. And that gets us
Mm-hmm.
down to like 300 or whatever the number is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's do that, right? And let's give us a quarter to work through that 300, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of the quarter, you have hopefully a better state of that application. You can talk about, let's turn on the mediums and see what happens, right? But it's being incremental and being smart about it. I think the contra case, the thing you don't want to do is go buy 12 different tools, run them on everything, produce tens of thousands of results, and then dump them on the teams that need to go fix them. That is just a non-starter. So for me, the ideal case is I have an ability to run tools, ideally in an automated fashion. If it has to be manual, that's fine too. But all of that output goes to one place. And this is what Defect Dojo does. So I'm somewhat biased in that regard, but I think it's really, really important because then in Defect Dojo or in that place, I can decide, you know what, this is worth passing on to say Jira, and I can push it
Mm-hmm.
into Jira. This other one, we're going to risk acceptance. And we're just not
Mm-hmm.
going to, I'm going to kick it down the road for 3 months because it's just not worth it. And you
Mm-hmm.
can do those things if you have them in a vulnerability management platform that allows you to manage those things before they go to downstream systems. The other thing that's super important about a vulnerability management thing like Defect Dojo is it normalizes the results. Every tool
Okay.
produces different weird results, right? Some things they call it a finding, other things it's an issue, other things it's a vulnerability, different names, different attributes. It's annoying. And I want to report those in one standard way. Well, one of the things
Mm-hmm.
Defect Dojo does is it reads in from, I don't remember what we're up to now, I think 168 different security tools and normalizes
Wow.
into one data model so that now when I'm feeding downstream systems, I just have to understand what Defect Dojo knows as a finding to be able to push it downstream. I don't have to understand that, oh, my SCA tool thinks a finding is this, and my SaaS tool thinks a finding is that, and my, cloud posture management tool thinks a finding is this other thing. I did that at first at Rack, and it was painful. I tried to write a thing for all of the different types of tools, and I went, no, I'm going to go mad.
Yeah.
We came up
It's
with
better to
different
standardize. Yeah.
Yeah, because then everything downstream is normalized. It all looks the same. And I can feed, like at some of the larger organizations I worked at, I would feed compliance, like RSA kind of compliance tools from Defect Dojo because it was normalized and it didn't matter what the tool was. But it also allows me to do interesting things like we find out that our SCA tool hasn't, maybe it got acquired by somebody and the quality's gone down. I don't really like it anymore. I want to shop around for a different SCA tool. Well, if everything lives in Defect Dojo, I can swap out that tool and my process doesn't change. Right? As long as I can fit it into Dojo, the process is the same downstream. So it also lets you, we didn't do this on purpose when we created Dojo, but it allows you to be able to tell vendors to go hit the bricks and get a different vendor that's performing better without interrupting how everything works at your
Makes
security.
a lot of sense. I just have a follow-up question on that. As you said, right? Let's say if I run SAST, I might get 1,000 findings, and out of those, one way to look at it is maybe we'll start with critical and high. Let's say if I'm running a startup and I have limited time, people, and budget, all of that, how do I prioritize between those 300? Like when I do critical and high, I got 300. Which one is the first one, or the second one, or
Right.
the third one?
Yeah, this is where what I've talked about earlier about understanding your risk profile and what are those things that are like existential to the business. Like I will violate this really important banking regulation if I don't do this thing. Well, that becomes priority, but that's really where you need that human brain. And that's another reason why that in between system that lets, the security team review and make those decisions. It's not unlike CVSS, right? It has the idea of a base score and then an environmental score, right? Security tools can give you base scores all day long, but they don't know your environment. That's really the value that a security professional provides to that process is they should understand the context in which that's perfect example. So SQL injection in an application is bad, right? We'd all kind of agree with that. SQL injection bad. So when I was at Rack, running the product security team, one of our new guys came in and found a SQL injection. And it just so happened that I was out at a meeting and the VP in charge of our group happened to be walking by and asked this fellow, hey, what are you doing today? I was like, oh, I found a SQL injection. And they were like, oh my God. And they fired up this whole incident response process. Well, they found a SQL injection in the system that allowed you to book meeting rooms at our home office. Not that important of a system.
Yeah.
Certainly
that
not worth
that context. Yeah, environment comes into picture, right?
Hugely important. Yeah. So we spun up this whole incident response process for something that was completely unimportant, right? And I don't blame the guy who found it. He was very new, and I'm sure he was excited. I was excited the first time I found SQL injection. I felt cool, like, oh, look what I found. I am awesome, right? But you have to take a deep breath and go, okay, this is bad. But like SQL injection in Rackspace.com, oh my goodness, like that's pull the Andon cord and alarms go off. But like, if people can't book rooms as easily when they're in the home office, that's annoying. But no one's going to die. Customers probably won't even notice. Like it's not going to impact revenue. Not worth getting excited about. Certainly not incident response time of excitement.
I totally agree. Like in like CVSS, as you highlighted, right? Like there are those three areas like base score, temporal, and environment. But most folks just look at the base score at the face value and they're like, oh, it's bad, we need to address it. But that's where, as you highlighted, right? Like look, adding the environmental aspect helps you in better prioritization.
It's kind of crucial because you're going to get more than your whoever is in charge, be it a dev or an ops team or whatever, DevOps, whoever has to go fix those things, you're going to have more than they can fix in the allotted amount of time they have. So yeah, like having a closer understanding. And it's funny, years ago I got asked one time, like, what would you tell people new to the field that they really need to think about. And it was context. Like, that's everything. Like,
Yeah.
like I used to do, I still do trainings, but when I used to do trainings on doing web app pen testing, I used to tell the class, like, I have a cross-site request forgery in one of the major websites on the internet today. I'm going to share it with you, but I'm going to embargo it. I don't want you to tell anybody. And then I'd show them how you could do cross-site request forgery to Google, which is irrelevant, right? But I can send you a link that allows you to, makes it look like Google thinks you want to search for, I don't know, naked penguins or something crazy, right? Like, is that a vulnerability technically? Yes. Yes, it's vulnerable. Is it important? Not hardly. So it like the context is so important, right?
Yeah.
It really makes a difference.
And that helps the security team and the product team also prioritize and work on it. So yeah, context is definitely key.
It's everything. Yeah, you have to be inside of the Rackspace LAN to be able to even see that app. So, like, you're already an employee or a contractor, or you have some sort of higher level of access anyway. You know, yeah, those kind of decisions. I mean, I understand the excitement. Like I said, when you first find these things and you're new, like, more power to you. I'm glad you're excited because you're likely to keep in the field and keep doing great work. But you know, you do have to pump the brakes and think a little bit about, okay, this is really bad, but how bad really is it because of A, B, and C?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great way to end the security questions. Thank you so much, Matt, for the fun conversation. Here are a few important points which stood out for me. The first one is context is key. When looking at vulnerabilities, do not just look at CVS's base score. Instead, understand your risk profile and add the environmental elements for better prioritization. Second one is in order to adhere to DevSecOps practices, be pragmatic. Like instead of going big bang approach, start small and iterate so that you can incorporate security into the existing DevOps practices. The third one is when it comes to prioritization of findings, whether it's from SAST or SCA or vulnerability management or any security tool in general, let the security team jump in and add context to help with information overload and prioritization. Thank you. We generally do another section which is called rating security practices. The way it works is I'll share a security practice. You need to rate it 1 through 5, 5 being the best. And you can add some context as well, like why you think it's 1 or a 5 or something like that. So let's start with the first one. Conduct periodic security audits to identify vulnerabilities, threats, and weaknesses in your systems and applications.
Yeah, I love this one. So this one I would give a 3. And the reason I would give it a 3 is it's kind of half the way there. Like, identifying issues and weaknesses, great. That is a perfectly good start. But you have to use that as a feedback loop to then create systems that don't have those problems in the first place. That's the real goal, right? Is to have systems that launch hardened. So yes, like, I love the signaling you get from doing those kind of periodic reviews or vulnerability management or scans or whatever it is. But the underlying question you have to ask yourself is, why am I finding these things? And more importantly, how do I make it so I don't find these things in the future?
Okay, makes sense. The next one is use strong passwords that contain a mix of uppercase, lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols, and change them frequently to avoid using the same password. Change them frequently and also avoid using the same password for multiple accounts.
So this one I'm going to get ranty on. I would give it a 1 because this feels like we're back in the mainframe days. That was where this came from, right? When you could only store 8-character passwords, and it cracking them took a reasonable amount of time on the very slow computers back in the day. That's no longer the case. And honestly, MFA and 2FA and FIDO are out. They exist. Like, FIDO's pretty new, granted, but MFA and 2FA, there's nothing new about that. That's been out for years and years and can buy you tons of improvement for very little effort. So
Yeah.
Like, I question the value of rotating passwords. In fact, shoot, when was it? That was in 2007, where I was working at the time. A coworker of mine was rolling out an encrypted laptop program where we were giving, doing a encrypted. This is when encrypted laptops were like a shocking thing, and we had to have
Mm-hmm.
third-party software to do it. Um, and the way he sold it was you have to have it was either 24 or 30. I want to say 24, a 24 character password. And we're doing these trainings, and I'm sitting in the audience with the other people doing this training just to kind of get a vibe on the room. And he says this 24 character, and everyone's like, oh my God. Oh. He goes, and you never have to change it. And they all went, like, what?
Oh.
I don't have to change it? He's like, yeah. Why would you change it ever? It's dumb. Make it really long. Then you don't have to change it. So I think we've gotten fixated on complexity when honestly a really long, not so complex password is harder to crack from a blind attack as an attacker. If I'm brute forcing, I'd rather have a complex 3-character password to brute force than a non-complex 10-character password any day, just in the amount of attempts I have to make. The numbers go up crazy fast. So that just drives me nuts. Now, the other half of this, I will agree with completely. Don't use the same password for multiple accounts. We have password managers. They're built into the OSs now. There's tons of third-party ones. You have lots to choose from. I use one. I love it because, shoot, this is another thing that happened a long time ago, but many years ago, there was a LinkedIn compromise where they lost all the creds. And people were like, oh, my God, I have to change all my passwords. And I went, I logged into LinkedIn. I updated my password, and I was done because all of my passwords are different. It really does make life better. Now, like, this is not to be pejorative to people that are older than me, but like for my parents who didn't grow up with computers, when they asked me this question about how do I do this, well, 2 things. One, I'm perfectly fine with you having different passwords for the important sites, but if you're going to localgrocerystore.com and downloading coupons, you could probably use the same password. It's not that exciting, right? Okay, fine.
Yeah.
I'll compromise there. That makes sense. The other thing that I've told several people that are getting up in years is go get an address book and write down all your passwords. Like, if you don't want to have a password manager, write them down. And people are like, oh my God, you're a security person. How can you tell people to write down their passwords? Look at the profile. My dad did this. How am I going to get my dad's passwords? I'm going to physically break into his house, know that the thing that says address book in his desk drawer isn't really an address book. It's a list of passwords, and then steal it. Like, that's a very different thing than having, the same password on every single website. And my dad did that, and he has unique passwords for all of his stuff. So it's really, it worked out great for him. Like, and God bless him.
That's a nice workaround.
Yeah, and it's reasonable. This is another thing where you have to be pragmatic, like being a purist and saying, oh my God, you should never write down a password for any reason. I don't know about that. Like, here's a reason. Like, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. The last question is, develop and regularly test and incident response plans to help quickly detect, respond to, and recover from security incidents.
Yeah, I'd give this one like a 4
Okay.
because I know people don't like being let's just say the wet blanket, right? What are we going to do if this happens? But it's not happening. Well, like, let's be, let's think forward. Let's think positive. Well, guess what? Like, bad stuff happens. The reason you have a spare tire in your car is because cars get flats. Although I did hear that EVs are starting to take them out, which is really weird to me. That's a whole nother story. But so you need to, when an incident happens, and I've been in worked lots of incidents and it's not fun, but when an incident is ongoing and happening, you need to have muscle memory. You need to know what to do. You need to have a plan. And planning under a panic is planning with like a stupid brain, right? You want to plan with your smart brain when you can sit back, sip a little tea, and think through the problem, right? That's what you do if you can do these proactively. So I think developing and regularly testing is a very good thing. The reason I wouldn't give it a 5 is I honestly don't think many people do it because it feels like an also ran. And it's not a sexy thing, right? You don't go to a conference and go, hey man, we tested our incident response plan this week and it went fine. Right? No one gets excited by it. But When things go crazy and things are on fire and everybody knows what to do, that's hugely valuable.
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. That makes a lot of sense as well. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining and sharing your knowledge. And like I could see reference to your past work, your current work. So yeah, it was a fun conversation. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, I enjoyed it greatly. These were all great questions, and I'm happy to share. That's how we all get better.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And to our viewers, thank you so much for watching. Hope you have learned something new. If you have any questions around security, share those at scale20.com and we'll get those answered by an expert in the security space. See you in the next episode. Thank you.